Hey everyone, and welcome back to the server-side web security wargame Natas, and today we're going to be looking at Natas level 8. So I'm going to open this up in a new tab. And now that we're authenticated, you can see on this page we have another HTML form, and in this case it's asking for us to input a secret and then submit the query with that button there. You can see we also have this view source code link, which is always helpful, so we'll open that in a new tab while we look at the source code, just to confirm there is nothing else funny going on this web page here. And with that, we'll hop over to the view source code link here, which typically contains the same set of information as viewing the page source, but you can see here we have some PHP information, which is going to help us sort of decode this challenge. No pun intended, because it looks like we have an encoded secret here, which looks to be some sort of hex data, but once we start looking into this code, we can actually sort of walk through it and see what is going on here. So again, we have this encoded secret variable, which is set to some sort of encoded value, it looks like hex, which kind of makes sense because we have a function here to sort of encode a secret, and you can see it's taking in a secret parameter or a secret argument here, which is probably going to be what we need to input. And we can see it's doing a couple different PHP functions here, so if we sort of walk backwards and sort of make sense of what's going on, we have our secret variable here, which is obviously something we don't know, something we need to figure out. It's being Base64 encoded, so it's taking that sort of binary data and translating it to Base64 encoding. Then you can see here the string reverse function is being called. That's basically just going to reverse whatever is the output of this Base64. So we're going to have some backwards Base64. But after that, you can see it runs the bin2hex function, and that's essentially going to take any binary data and translate that to hex, which sort of makes sense in terms of what we're looking at here. This looks like hex data. So then we can look down and start taking a look at the actual logic of this page here. So you can see it's looking for that submit parameter in the post method. So you can see here in this nested if statement, it's going to be running this encode secret function on whatever we set in the secret parameter of the post method. And it's going to run this function on whatever we submit, which obviously, again, as we walk through, it's going to do Base64, it's going to reverse that, and then translate it to hex. And then if whatever we submit after it has gone through this function, if it exactly matches whatever is encoded secret here, which is this value, in that case, we will get the password for Natas 9. Otherwise, we're going to get wrong secret. So that pretty much runs through what the PHP is doing here in the back end. So this is sort of a very basic and rudimentary example of what a username and password authentication will look like on a web page. So if you think about it, your password on a website is not going to be stored in clear text. It's going to be sort of encoded, kind of like this, but obviously not in a way that's reversible. It's going to be using hashes. But essentially, when you log into a website, you put in your username and password, well, the backend takes those values. It essentially runs the same hashing function on whatever you input as a password, and it's going to check that if the value that you inputted after it's gone through that hashing matches what the hashed value is in the database. In that case, it'll let you in. That's sort of how websites know that you've entered the right password without knowing actually what your password is or without storing it in clear text in the database. And it's not the best example. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes on with high-level hashing algorithms and using stuff like salts and stuff, which we might get into later. But once again, just sort of as a very basic comparison, this is kind of similar to what we're doing here. And so with that, so what is our goal going to be here? Obviously, essentially to decode whatever this value is. And the way we can do that, because we have access to see what this function is running, we can sort of just reverse engineer this and do the same thing, but in reverse. So what we're going to need to do essentially is just run some PHP locally so we can sort of run these same functions or run the opposite of these functions. It's going to be the easiest way, essentially. We want to be running the same sort of tech stack as to what's going on in the back end here so we can get the most accurate results. If you don't have PHP installed, just look at your package manager. It should be fairly simple. If I should have PHP installed here, which I do. So in that case, we can actually make a script, or we can make a file to run PHP, or we can just run it in the command line. But we'll make a file here just to sort of decode this value, and we'll walk through step by step what's going to be happening. So I'm just going to run subl to open Sublime Text as we've been doing, and then I'm just going to call this decode.php, and this should open Sublime Text up. And once that's open, we can actually just start by opening our file here with the sort of PHP expected syntax. That's going to be a left arrow bracket, the question mark, and then we're just going to write PHP. And then to close out the file for good practice, we're just going to do a question mark with the closing sort of arrow tag there. And anything within this, sort of like how we saw in the source code here, anything within this is going to be executed as PHP. And all I'm going to do actually is just copy this exact variable here, just so we have it and we have access to it within our script or within our code. And then just to make sure everything's working, I'm going to print out that encoded secret. Control B to run the build mode here, but what I might have to do first is just I might have set this up wrong, so I'm just going to need to manually select PHP there, and then I'm going to do Control B to run that, and you can see we're getting the build output there. I'm just going to do Control Alt and 2 to open this in a new tab, and then I'm going to drag that over just so we have the code and the build output here. So right now we're just sort of printing the encoded secret here. What we're going to do essentially is just sort of use the reverse of whatever functions we used here to once again decode that value. So as I said before, the last thing that's running in this function here, the encode function, is the bin to hex function, which we're going to sort of reverse by doing the hex to bin function, which is going to take the outputted hex data and send it back to binary or convert it back to binary data. And how do I know that? Well, if you look up PHP bin to hex, you can see we're going to get a result here. And if we take a look at the actual php.net, the manual for PHP, essentially, if we just take a look at what bin to hex is, you can see it's converting that binary data into whatever the hexadecimal representation is. But if we scroll down a bit, you can see the related function here is going to be hex to bin. Essentially what it's going to do is just decode whatever the hex is and translate that back into binary. So to run that, we can just do hex, whoops, if I can type, hex to bin, and then we're going to enclose that in parentheses. And now if we run this, just run the same thing here, we are getting what looks to be Base64 data, but it's kind of reversed. You can see the padding here, or the equal signs in Base64. They should be at the end, not at the start, which sort of signifies that this is reversed. So to do that, we can run the same function as in our source code there, and that's just going to be str rev string reverse. And then if we close that out and run this again, you can see that looks more like Base64 data. The padding is at the end as it should be, and all we really need to do now is just sort of decode this from Base64 to normal text or to ASCII text, and that's what we'll do here with Base64 underscore decode, because if you remember in the source code here, it's running Base64 underscore encode. Well, we can obviously assume decode is going to be the opposite, or we could just look up PHP Base64 decode. And you can see the first result here from that PHP manual is going to be the Base64 underscore decode function. You can see it's decoding the data encoded with Base64. And obviously, once we run that command, we're just going to enclose it in another set of parentheses there. So we sort of have this, if I were to just drag this out, we have this sort of opposite version of what we see in the source code here to decode the originally encoded string. Then if we run this with Control B, you can see we are getting an output here, which looks to be some random data, but in fact, this is the secret that we need to input in order to extract the password on this level. So I'm just going to copy that, and then I can close out the Sublime text here. And just to show you, we can actually just run PHP directly on a file or a PHP file. So if I just run PHP on this decode.php, we're getting the same result here. So what we can do is just sort of export this out to secret in case we need it. And there we go, that looks good. And now all we need to do is just sort of make our getflag.py script, and I can do that just by copying the one from the last level, and we'll sort of refactor it a bit to work for this. There we go, I'll open that up in Sublime Text. Just to make sure this is still working, I'm going to run this, and you can see we're getting the password for the previous level. So all we need to do essentially is just copy this, refactor this a bit to a Natas 8, paste in that new password. Whoops, I hit build by accident. We can take out this sort of, from the last level, if you remember, we were doing some directory traversal or local file inclusion, so we can just take that out completely, save that, and we should be good. I'm just going to run our original response.txt. There we go, so that's looking good. You can see the form here with the form method of post. So what we're going to need to do, obviously, first is change our request to a post request. And then if you remember, we're going to need to include some data, and that's going to be 2 parameters. So we're going to have the submit to equal submit, or whatever we want. It just needs to be there. And then we're going to set the secret parameter to that value that we've extracted from our decode function. In the request, we're going to add the data argument, and that's going to be, if you remember, a dictionary, which we can specify with the curly brackets there. And then essentially it's just going to be key value pairs. So we're going to do submit to equal submit, and then separate with a comma. We're going to do secret, and that's going to equal that value that we copied there from our decode function. So that looks good to me. I forgot to turn on word wrap, just so this is more readable for you guys. Perfect, there we go. So now I'm just gonna run this and pray that everything works. No, what did we forget? Oh, I forgot the equal sign. So data, data has to equal the dictionary. Anyways, that should work now. There we go, yep. And if we scroll up, we can actually format this build output as HTML just to make it sort of more readable. And you can see access granted, the password for Natas 9 is, and there we're getting the password. Perfect. And now all we need to do to complete our getFlag script is just sort of extract that value. If you think about how to do that, well, we can sort of search off this Natas 9 is, and so we'll just put that in front of our grab all sort of indicator in our regex there. And don't forget the space. And then just for after that, I think we're good because it's a new line. So if I run that, that should work fine. And there we go. So we're getting the password extracted, completing this level, sort of dealing with PHP functions and sort of decoding an encoded string. And as the paranoia sets in, we will test this, of course. We're going to run Python 3. We're going to run Python on our getFlag script. We're going to send the output to, we'll just call it Natas 8 as always. And I cannot spell Python. And there we go. Now we can run our natas.sh on Natas 9. And then we're going to just substitute in the value of that Natas 8. Perfect, there we go. We are not getting a 403, we're not getting unauthorized. It looks good, and we're, as always, getting a hint to what the next level is going to entail in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching. We're starting to sort of veer into new territories and new languages here, dealing with some PHP stuff. Very exciting, very fun, and I cannot wait for the next level, so thanks as always.